Hello, this is Matt Pullin, and I'm going to go over my game against Michael Auger from the 2007 Illinois Open, and this is in round 4. My rating going into the event was 1895, and Michael Auger's is 1959. So it started out with my English opening, and he plays c6 on move 2. The goal is he wants to play d5 and achieve the center pawn duo of pawns on e5 and d5. So a developing move like bishop to g2 is not good enough. So I have to play d4 right away, and he captures, and I capture with queen, and the queen is safe here because the knight cannot come to c6 to attack it. So he plays d5, and we trade pawns on d5, and now he has an isolated queen pawn. And the isolated queen pawn gives him a lot of activity. He's got open c and e files, and his pieces can come out freely. But the disadvantage is in the endgame the pawn cannot be defended by another pawn. So my strategy, as outlined by Nimzovich in his book My System, is to keep a blockade on the pawn on d4. So if I keep the blockade by keeping a piece on d4, then he will not be able to advance his pawn, because a common tactic for the isolated queen pawn side is to advance the pawn and free up the square behind the pawn for his pieces to come in. So in this position I play bishop to g2, forcing him to defend, and he should play knight to f6, but instead he plays bishop to e6, and this he has a different plan, which does not involve knight to f6. But I don't like this move because it commits his bishop to be behind the pawn. If he plays knight to f6, then he can advance the bishop to a more aggressive square like f5 or g4. So I play knight to f3. Knight to c3 would not be good here because knight to c3 gives him a target to advance his pawn d5 to d4. So he plays knight c6, and I go over to a4. Another disadvantage of having the bishop on e6, if he wants to put the bishop on d7 to set up a discovered attack on my queen, then he's losing the tempo. So the queen is quite active and safe on a4. And he plays queen d7, and I castle, and he plays f6. So his plan is to play bishop to h3 and then advance his kingside pawns in order to open lines on my kingside and take advantage of his greater space. But it's kind of hard to attack on the kingside when your center is vulnerable. So I move my rook onto the d file to pressure his isolated pawn, and he brings his bishop out, and I play knight to d2, and he brings his knight out, and I play knight to b3, attacking his bishop. So he goes back, and I blockade the pawn. So step 1 of my operation is complete. I have a functioning blockade on the d4 square. So he brings his bishop out, and I could avoid the trade by bringing the bishop to h1, but there's no reason to do so because trades benefit the side that does not have the isolated queen pawn. So I bring my bishop out, and he trades, and then he trades on d4. And already I'm quite happy because I've traded off 2 pairs of pieces. I play bishop takes because the bishop was worse placed than the knight, and castles, and now I have a little combination to improve the position of my pieces. I play the bishop to c5, pinning the knight to the rook, and obviously he plays rook to e8 to get out of the pin, and I blockade with the knight on d4. So now, in some variations I could be threatening bishop takes e7 tactically. But he brings his knight to g6, which is a sensible idea. He wants to come over to the king side to cause trouble. And I trade on c6. So now there is no longer an isolated queen pawn, but he is hanging pawns. And the rule with hanging pawns is you want to force one of them to advance. In this case it already has to d5. And then once one of them advances, the back one can be blockaded, like I have with the bishop on c5. So he always has to watch his pawn on c6 now. So I play e3 because my e2 pawn was hanging, and he plays h5, and I play rook to d4. And it's hard to believe that he can achieve anything with an attack with pawns on the king side because I'm dominating the center. He brings his knight to e5, and I double rooks. In some lines I might be threatening rook takes d5, but not right away because his queen is guarded. So he plays g5, but the drawback of this is he's weakening squares around his own king, specifically the square at g6. So I play my queen to c2, so I'm staring at those squares, f5, g6, h7. So he's playing in a very risky fashion. He's not afraid of weakening his own king in order to try to get at my king. So he brings his king to g7 to control g6, and I bring my rook over to a4 to pressurize the a pawn, and he brings his knight there. So now he's really threatening to play h4, and I don't want him doing that. So I played h4 myself. This move required a lot of calculation, pawn to h4, because pawn takes pawn and pawn takes pawn, which he did. And now I felt that because I can get a rook to the open g file faster, that I would be better here. He moved his king over, and I moved my rook to g1, and he played rook g8, and now he's threatening a discovered check, knight f4, so I brought my king down, and he gave check with his queen, and I moved over, and he attacked my rook, and I played rook g3 to cut off his queen from the center. Now in this position it looks kind of scary for white because he's moving his king around and his king has to run up to the center, but the only black piece that's doing anything in the attack is the queen. So queen to h1 check and king d2 and queen f1, and it's unless you have weaknesses, it's very hard to achieve anything just with the queen alone. You need the rest of your pieces, and his pieces aren't doing much. So f2 is threatened here, and I saw this position when I played pawn to h4, and my idea was to play king c3 and b3 and a3 and achieve safety on the queen side. But when I actually got to this position, I found queen to f5, defending f2, and this is a dual-purpose move. It's also an attacking move, threatening queen to d7 check. And after this, black is just lost. So he moves his rook down with the idea of running away with his king to g8 and h7. And there are all sorts of direct attacks on the f-pawn, like rook to f3 and rook to f4 and bishop to d4. I didn't see anything convincing, so I just improved my position with rook to b4. And now rook to b7 check is a problem, so he brought his queen back to a6. And in this position I played bishop to d4 with the attack on f6. The threat is queen takes f6 check and queen takes rook. So if he plays c5, then I just take on d5 for check and his rook on a8 is hanging. So he tried rook over to g8, so that his rook is not hanging anymore on a8. But I did not take on f6. I found something a lot better. I captured the knight on g6. And the idea is I want to take away his best defensive piece and to move his rook to a square where it cuts off his king from running away. So he actually resigned because if rook takes rook, then queen check. And then he's got to move back here, and then bishop mate. So the rooks in this position cut off his king's escapes to g6 or g8. So, yeah, also c5 in this position leads to rook takes check, and he loses his queen. So that was my game against Michael Auger from the 2007 Illinois Open. I hoped you enjoyed watching it, and that you learned some concepts of dealing with isolated queen pawns, and also how multiple pieces need to be involved in the attack, not just the queen. Well, talk to you next time.